Welcome. I am Tracy Ellis Ross, and I am so thrilled to be kicking off Variety's Power of Women conversations with the panel, Why Women Will Determine the 2020 Election. And I am joined by the filmmakers of All In, The Fight for Democracy, which is a fantastic, important film that sheds light on voter suppression and the need to continue to care and to vote. So please welcome the talented Liz Garbus and Lisa Cortez, our directors, and their producer, the incomparable founder of Fair Fight, an activist and public servant, a leader, someone that I have chosen to call my friend, that I've gotten to be close up with on numerous occasions, Stacey Abrams. So ladies, I will just start by saying thank you for making this film. For so many reasons, but from a personal standpoint, I feel like I'm in a learning phase right now. I wish I had been as curious and as aware of the importance of just democracy, in all honesty, when I was growing up, and that I had done a better job paying attention. And as we've moved into these complicated and unprecedented times, so many things have occurred, and I've wished that I had more information. And a lot of them seemingly are confusing for a reason. And I have to say, when people talk about voter suppression and even gerrymandering, like you kind of understand, but like I kind of don't. And it's like connected, but it's not connected. And how does that really affect me? And you guys did such a comprehensive and intriguing job at laying it all out. And it was not confusing. I mean, I took 8 pages of notes. But it was connected both to the larger context and the history and how it affects us now in this moment, and particularly with this election. And so let's just dive in on some questions. Could one of you describe in, I don't know, a sentence or two, what the movie is, what the documentary is?
Well, I'll start by saying All In is about the fight for the vote in our country for the past several centuries. And it tells the story, which I think is, as you mentioned, not very well understood, of, the way in which the franchise was really, really never widely used or widely given to most American citizens. From the outset, it was 6% of Americans who had that power to vote. And then we've gone through ups and we've gone through downs, and we chart that history. And we do it through the story of Stacey Abrams, her political education, her activism, and of course, her 2018 run for governor. I think it's a little bit of a horror movie because it's sort of like every time you think, that monster's coming out and you think you've slayed the dragon, another little monster rises up just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water. After Reconstruction, for instance, then you get the Black Coats and the Mississippi Plan. I could go on and on, but there is hope also. Lisa, what did I miss?
This is a film that is about our history, and it's good spinach.
That's fantastic. And I agree. I think it is about that. I think it's about hope. I think it's about solution, though. And that was what I was so intrigued by is, for example, it's not the judges that will save us, it's the people. We all have the power to change that reality one vote at a time. There is hope and solution in this movie, but I think, and what I have found is that the more information I have, the more educated I am, the more empowered I feel. It's clearly a call to action, this movie. When did the idea for All In manifest? And was there a specific moment of inspiration? Was it Stacey's run and what happened there? And I'm just going to throw a couple of questions out because I have a feeling you'll answer them all in one. What was your biggest challenge in creating the film? And was there a surprise that came up in creating this?
Can I throw to Stacey?
Please.
Because the origin story is 2 words and one fabulous woman. And that's Stacey Abrams.
Thank you. So, in the wake of 2018, I had been approached by filmmakers and others who wanted me to participate in a documentary about that election. I had no interest in reliving the 2018 election. I was there. I knew it. I knew it happened. But 2 things happened. One, I was in a conversation with a staff member, a young woman who was, there with me through the work I'd done on the New Georgia Project to register voters. She was a part of my campaign. She was instrumental to Fair Fight. And yet we were talking about the poll tax that is occurring in Florida because of Amendment 4 and the refusal to allow returning citizens to vote without paying these absurd fees and fines. And she said, why don't they use a better term? Why do they call it a poll tax? It just doesn't seem very interesting. And it hit me that, she's Gen Y and you've got Gen Z. I'm the daughter of people who were involved in the civil rights movement. And so many of us take for granted the lexicon of the voting rights moment. We understand what preceded it and what followed from it. But for her generation, there are terms of art that had no resonance. And so what hit me was we need to tell a story about what voter suppression is, how it began, and how it manifests itself now. But my mission was to do it without me being in the film at all. And so now I'm going to hand it to the filmmakers because my surprise was that I was in the film. Liz and Lisa, take it away.
Well, yes. I mean, when we first met with Stacey, she was fairly clear that she didn't want the film to be about her. And it wasn't out of some sort of like false modesty. It was because, if you make it about one person, one story, then you can say, oh, that's Georgia or that's Brian Kemp. And, that's that story. And what was crucial, I interpreted her message as it being crucial to make sure we don't lose the forest for the trees and that we tell the whole story. Georgia 2018 does not exist in a vacuum. It is the culmination of years and years, and especially of an evisceration of the Voting Rights Act and the results of Shelby versus Holder. But Lisa and I felt that we were interpreting her message more spiritually than literally, because we felt that her story was the connective tissue for us to jump back and forth between now and then, past and present.
Well, it was interesting because what it did was, because people know who you are, Stacey, and you have a clarity in the way that you tell your own story and that you speak about the context that you are a part of, it draws you in a way that you can identify. For those that are in their 20s or whatever that is, we were hearing about this on the news. You heard Kemp's name and whatever, but you didn't understand the magnitude of what it was a part of and why it was something to be so appalled by. And I don't want to get to the concession, quote unquote, speech now. We'll get there. But I think that plays into that so much, and it gives you a real thing to hold. And kudos to both of you as filmmakers in how you told the story. It is a complicated story, all of this for a reason, but it was clear in how you told it.
Yeah, I think in keeping with good spinach, it's important to make certain that when you share this history, that it's not past tense. I think, to engage with audiences, they need to see not only the cyclical nature of the history, but also its present day manifestations. And oftentimes, I think our audience are people who look like us. And we have not seen ourselves centered in these type of political histories.
And I want to be clear. My reticence was absolutely wrong. What makes Liz and Lisa the perfect filmmaking duo was that they ignored me and they knew how to tell a story that could reach beyond what I saw as a reductive story. And instead they made it this conversation that, to Lisa's point, it not only centered, Black people who have long been the targets of voter suppression, it understood that no matter who began as the target, we now know that it attacks Native Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, poor people, young people, and their capacity to tell this broader story and to still confine it to, a little more than an hour and a half, but more importantly, to make it resonant at every single moment was something, I wanted this to be something greater. And my deepest gratitude goes to the fact that I was introduced to Liz. And when we talked about it the first time, she got it because she had been thinking about voting rights, that when we talked to Lisa, she understood instantly the gravity of this conversation, and that together they ignored me and understood that I was not a filmmaker. I'm just a really, really active consumer. And they did an amazing job.
That's what I was going to ask. I have two questions from what you both just said. One, Stacey, what was this experience like for you? I know you have your hands in many areas and don't sleep much because of how much you do. What was it like? And was it similar to how you operate, but just in a different genre? Or was it totally new?
Oh, it was deeply intrusive. And it was not the thing I woke up in the morning going, yay, I get to go do this. Look, I was writing a book at the same time, Our Time Is Now, Power, Purpose, and the Fight for Fair America. And so one of the first moments where I got an inkling of what was to come, Liz and Lisa emailed me and said, can we see some pages from the books? And I write in secret. I write my stuff. I send it to my editors. I get my edits back, but I don't workshop. I don't talk to other people if I can avoid it. I'm a terrible politician in that way. I'm much more insular than most politicians are. And so the internal exposure required of the conversations they led me through, it was difficult, but I understood the necessity. Mm-hmm. But there was also this point where having this conversation in my head as I wrote a book was very different than having the conversation out loud, because the questions I was asking myself were not the same questions that they were asking. And I think that's what makes the film so textured and relevant, because they took my story as part of a catalyst, but they knew to ask me things I wasn't necessarily going to inquire of myself.
I also want to say that to Stacey's credit, she knew when to put the producer hat on and to lean into that part of the process, and to introduce us to her parents, because they were going to be the secret weapon that we were going to use if there were pushback, Stacey.
That's amazing. That leads me to my next question. The people that are interviewed in this documentary are extraordinary, and of all different kinds of people. How did you find them? How did you choose them? And what was the thread that you had to, or the needle that you had to thread in order to connect them all?
When we first met with Stacey, she talked about certain people that she felt were incredibly important to this conversation. And as a great collaborator, wrote beautiful introductory notes to these folks. And then in turn, as we were building our timeline, we knew that there were historical beats and also our verite contemporary stories that we wanted to explore. And I think everything started building one off of another. It's you see this history, you know where you're going, and you speak to one great person and they're like, well, have you spoken to Kristen Clark? And, it's this kind of beautiful waterfall that happens that leads you to the known voices, but also to the discovery of new voices. And what was especially important for our entire team was that we tried to get the mosaic, of experiences reflected in the construction of the story.
Okay, let's move a little bit to voter suppression specifically and voting. Stacey, you mentioned this. You said about who is suppressed. But I'd love you to talk just a little bit about, is race the most objective target for voter suppression? And if so, why? And how are people chosen to be suppressed? I'm leading an answer.
I see this. I will follow. Look, okay. We talk about it a lot in the film, but from the inception of our country, race has been the most singular target of voter suppression. Women were silenced in the Constitution. They were not considered part of the body politic, but the explicit exclusion of Blacks, we were denied humanity. Native Americans were denied existence. And then the 1790 Naturalization Act said that only white people of good character could even think about moving to the United States and becoming citizens. So that knocked out everyone else. You fast forward, it began with the Whigs and it proliferated over almost every major political party that held power that saw that power challenged by the inclusion of voices that had been oppressed by their power. And so Black people, we've had the longest history of oppression in the United States, side by side with Native Americans. And we know that when Latinos and Asian Americans, when they started to come into their own and their voices had the potential to change the outcome of elections, suppression was designed to keep them in check, because it's all about power. This is a power conversation. And there are politicians who understand that if you want to hold and keep your power, you need to expand your ideology, expand your behavior, you need to engage and include. And there are other politicians who believe that their belief system is so sacrosanct that they would rather steal the voices of others than adapt to the needs of the people. And in the 21st century, this is largely the province of Republicans. But let's be clear, the Whigs did it. They were the ones who wrote the Constitution. The Democrats did it. They were the architects of Jim Crow. We know that Republicans and Democrats in various ways did it during the mid-20th century. We know that Native Americans did not have the right to vote in the United States as a whole thing until 1948. They didn't become citizens until 1924, and that the longest journey has belonged to African Americans because we first had to prove our humanity. We had the right to vote, we had it stripped away, and it was reluctantly returned to us. And I want to flag one thing that you said at the outset about feeling that you should have known this. From 1965 to 2013, we had the penumbra of the Voting Rights Act, which meant we didn't have to think about it too much. And that was actually a good thing. When I started doing voting rights at the age of 17 until I was 40, I didn't have to think about protecting the right to vote. My mission was expanding it. And when that shelter was stripped away by the Supreme Court of the United States, once again, the target was painted on the back of African Americans. It covers every community of color. It covers young people, because in the 21st century, young people are more likely to be communities of color, but they're also more likely to want power that is being denied by the Republican Party, and poor people because they're just always inconvenient. And so we have to recognize that voter suppression may manifest itself in different ways in each generation, but its targets remain singular, and its targets remain consistently those who want access to power, access to progress.
If there's anybody that's watching, because I knew but didn't know that the Shelby versus, Shelby versus Holder County was the case in 2013 that went to the Supreme Court that gutted the Voting Rights Act. And so from 2013 till now, so the next question is voter suppression happening right now?
Yes. And Stacey Abrams can tell you exactly how.
I mean, well, let me take a moment to just plug this, the importance of people watching this documentary. We will talk about where it is available for you to see it. But if you can watch this before you vote, I think it will be very helpful to you. We are going to try in this conversation, I'm going to try to get some key bits of information to you so that you feel informed as you go to the polls. So many people have already voted. We are obviously encouraging people to vote as early as possible. One of the lines that I loved from the documentary was, voter turnout is the best answer to voter suppression. So in the middle of this conversation, I will take a moment to say voter turnout, which means you, if you're watching, that means you need to turn out and vote. That means you need to make a plan. That means you need to get your ballot and fill it out, be informed about it, and then get it into a box. Get it into a box. And then once you do that, you can make sure other people do that. Now, that was our commercial. We're going to go back to what we were talking about. You were about to say things about voter suppression now.
So voter suppression has three facets, and it's been true since the beginning. The architecture of voter suppression is: one, can you register and stay on the rolls? Two, can you cast a ballot? And three, does your ballot get counted? And so what the film does is really illuminate what that looked like in the 18th century, in the 19th century, in the 20th century, in the 21st century. But fundamentally, if you cannot register, then you are denied any participation in this process. That's what returning citizens are facing in Florida, those who had their rights restored and then stripped away. So if you cannot register, this is a moot conversation. But in states like Georgia and Ohio, we also have the very aggressive form of voter purging. That means that even if you make it on the rolls, you may not get to stay. And this happens actually in 44 states. It's just Georgia and Florida and Ohio are really, really, really aggressive about it. The second is, can you cast your ballot? And in the 21st century, that's largely been a fight over polling places being shut down, who has the right to vote early. And in COVID times, we know that it's about who can vote by mail. And I couldn't have asked for a more perfect encapsulation of this fight, where you see Republicans fighting to deny people the right to vote safely without risking their lives. And in Alabama, just a week or so ago, they said that disabled elderly people could not vote from their cars. The law itself doesn't say you can't, but the courts decided that if someone wants to say no, the Supreme Court said that you didn't have the right, if you were going to be exposed to COVID as an elderly disabled person, that you still had to risk your life to vote. And the Secretary of State, I believe, said, well, if you really want to vote, you should have to work at it. So there's that. And then there's, does your ballot count? Also known as Florida. We know that so often ballots get cast and get thrown out because of signature match laws. And as I pointed out, my signature doesn't match from CVS to Kroger, but it's also a question of naked ballots in Pennsylvania. If you didn't realize you have to use 2 envelopes for the first time in your life to send a piece of mail back, they can use that as a reason to throw out your ballot. And so we know across the country, it takes different formats, but that's basically the categories. Can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you cast your ballot? And does your ballot get counted?
You know, it's like, let me count the ways, right? It's like recently in Texas, the GOP trying to limit, the number of ballot drop-off boxes per county. I mean, it's a very naked and bald moment in which this pandemic, as Stacey is saying, is stripping away a lot of the, the kind of the fig leaves over the intentionality of all of this. And I guess the only silver lining is that, like, here we are talking about it, right? And like with all the crap that is being thrown, or the misinformation or disinformation about voter fraud, that's bad information, but there's a lot of good information out there countering it. So I think that's the silver lining of all of this.
2 things. One, can you take a moment to talk about why it shouldn't be hard to vote? Because I'm seems obvious, but obviously it's not, and people have different ideas.
Well, the onus should not be on the people. I mean, the underlying tenet of a democracy, it is of, for, and by, and it should not be made so hard. And these boundaries, and these barriers, I should say, we see are systemic, and they are a part of, of the monster movie that we are continuously trying to slay.
And it's also so hard for who? Who is it being made hard for? Is it being made hard for that older woman in our film who doesn't have a birth certificate because at the Jim Crow hospital she wasn't given one? It's so hard for the Native American who doesn't have the street address on their reservation and doesn't have the papers. So it's a question of, for me, I have no try. It takes me 20 minutes to go vote. So I think the thing about it is, who is it being made hard for and why? And it has to do with power, and it has to do, of course, with institutional racism. But it's one thing if it was hard for everybody also. I mean, that would be a different situation. It shouldn't be.
So there's a lot of talk about people cheat by mail voting. That is not true. So can you speak to any concerns that every trick in the book is being used right now to suppress votes in this election cycle? And what is the best way for a voter as an individual to fight voter suppression?
So the best way for an individual to fight voter suppression is, one, to know it exists. Okay. And this has been a point of contention for so long because of exactly what Liz just laid out, which is that it's not hard for everyone. And so if you have had the ease of voting, it is difficult to imagine that it's more difficult, that people have a different experience. But there's also the very real distinction in how you have engaged the right to be a citizen and what people can take for granted. But it's also the logic. Sometimes it sounds completely logical. She referenced the elderly woman who had like a plethora of proof points of who she was. but the state decided that she had to provide the one form of identification she couldn't. And this is intentional because it sounds logical. Of course, you have to prove who you are to vote. That's always been true. What's different in the 21st century is how restrictive those forms of ID are and how hard they are for people to gain. And it's intentionally hard. By the same token, oh, everyone can go and vote. There's a polling place nearby. Well, that may be true for you, but if you lived in Clay County in Georgia, there was one polling place. And if you didn't own a car, there's no public transit. And when the polling place used to be a mile away, yes, you could, if you needed to walk there, you could. But if you don't have the ability to drive 10 to 15 miles in a rural county, you cannot vote. And in Georgia in 2018, we know between 54,000 and 85,000 people literally could not vote because they could not reach the one place where they could cast a ballot.
One of the lines that really stuck out at me is that if you have gun registration, you could vote. What state was that?
Texas. In Texas, you can vote with your gun license, but not your student ID. You pay the same state, the same money. In fact, you pay more money for your student ID. I went to school in Texas. You paid some money, but
that just in and of itself was like so suspect and tricky. I was like, come on now.
And it's that kind of thing. And so what we need people to do, number one, know that it exists, understand that architecture, because you don't know you're being hurt if you don't understand that you have the right not to be in pain. The second is don't panic. Once you know what the fight is, part of the reason for Fair Fight and for the organization I created and other organizations is to arm you with the information you need and to help you navigate the distractions of the lies. The lie of voter fraud, not real, not an issue, does not create. The FBI director under Donald Trump said it's basically, he didn't say this, but it's basically hokum. The third then is make your plan. Go to iwillvote or go into allinforvoting.com and you can get all the information you need about what the rules are where you live, because one of the other impediments is that we don't have a single democracy. One of the reasons it's problematic is that we don't have one democracy. We've got 50 democracies in the states, and you add the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, all the rest of the territories. You shouldn't have to get a degree in electoral law in order to cast a ballot. And so allinforvoting.com has put together this comprehensive space because we want people to know where to go to make their plan to vote so they can cast their ballots and so they can know that their ballots will count.
Can you say that one more time just so we can repeat it where people can go?
Allinforvoting.com.
Allinforvoting.com. You can remember that, guys. What is the importance in having women of color vote in this election? And what is the most important thing that women can be doing now as we head into the election?
First is supporting our VP. It's historic. It's important. Her presence there and how it speaks to the next cycle of people who are going to be running. It becomes an aspirational moment, her success. We're such an important sector. And I think, if you don't speak out and leverage and plant your flag, people don't realize that your flag needs to be acknowledged. So the concerns that we have for our community, the civic engagement we have historically had and continue to, is a very powerful block that needs to be recognized and that we need to continue to lean into. When we look at some of the incredible moments during the civil rights movement, and you think of Amelia Boykin and the blows she took on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, shame on any of our sisters, shame on any of our Americans who cannot remember that moment and sit on the sidelines, particularly in this really important election.
I think for the younger generation who doesn't have as much of a close relationship to that march, that linked arm march across that bridge, the protests and uprising that has occurred in this last wave right here, it is time to take that protest and transform it into power. And I really feel like your vote is your currency. And we have been taught, I think, in this country to think that the election is a transaction. It's like you do one thing and it's over, and it's not. I heard someone say it's the work of transformation, and it's a process, it's a journey. And I think being educated about voter suppression helps you to walk into this as an informed voter, and then to continue to hold your elected leaders accountable. There's a continuum here. We are taking up the work of our ancestors, but we are also taking up our own work, the work that we have been doing and that so many have been doing. And the vote translates, it's one of our tools in how to translate that into power and to elect people that can get into those rooms to have those conversations on our behalf.
Tracy, I would just add to your notion of currency. Voting isn't magic. It's not going to fix every moment, but because of the demographic changes in this country, we've got more currency than we've ever had before. In 1992, when the Rodney King verdict came down, I was part of protests against the brutality, against the inequities, against systemic racism. But by November of 1992, that wasn't a conversation anymore, really. That conversation persists. We saw at last week's debate, a conversation that would not have happened and did not happen in 92. And that's because the currency of power that we hold as voters, especially Gen Y and Gen Z, that currency has so much more power because there are more of us, which means our buying power, not as a transaction of this for that, but our ability to buy access to progress is so different. And we have to leverage that in ways that require, we know that it is about coming back again and again, that it's not magic. It is a process. And that if we keep at that process, we will see the progress we need.
Stacey, am I right to say that the voter turnout in the primary by Black women gave us the leverage and currency for Kamala to be chosen as the VP and for it to be a Black woman?
And I would add to that, it's the currency of young Black women who were protesting in the streets, who said that you cannot tell me you see me. You cannot say the name of Breonna Taylor and not believe there has to be a payment made for what she represented. And I think it's important for us to recognize that it's a longitudinal thing. If it had only been about, South Carolina, no, it's about Alabama in 2017. It's about 2008. It is about every election where steadily Black women in particular have shown up and had such a consistent investment that there was the moment to say, if you are going to rely on us, you are going to have to acknowledge us. And to his credit, what Joe Biden did was he said that diversity is more than just lip service. It has to be shown in action. And he did so.
Your speech, not a concession speech, was an incredibly powerful moment in real time and in the film. Can you speak about the process of getting to the podium to end your campaign, your launch for Fair Fight on that night? And can you expand on where you and your organization are at the moment, and have your priorities shifted at all?
On November 6th, 2018, I stood on a stage at 1 a.m. and said, we're going to keep fighting until every vote gets counted. 10 days went by, and during that 10 days, we filed lawsuits. Other groups filed lawsuits. We saw more and more people have their votes counted. Thousands of votes got added to the total. But we also learned more and more about how aggressive and egregious the voter suppression had been. I'm Black. I'm from the South. I can count. And when the guy in charge of the election is going to be in charge of deciding whether I win or lose, I had a pretty good notion it wasn't going to go my way. And so during that 10 days, actually, I went through a lot of the stages of grief. I really enjoyed anger a lot, but I had a notepad and I started sketching out, okay, if I'm not governor, what do I do? And for me, there's an ecosystem to progress. It is having policies that actually affect our lives. It's having a census that counts us and divvies up our power and our economic capacity equally and fairly. And then it's protecting our democracy and having the right to vote. And so on that pad, I created Fair Fight, Fair Count, and the Southern Economic Advancement Project, because I'm a daughter of the South, and that's where the policies for me were so important, because my mission is to translate progressive policy into Southern Fair Fight, though, was the entity I announced on the 16th, because when I went to that stage, when I stood in front of those cameras, my first obligation was to acknowledge the legal sufficiency of what had happened, that we had laws that permitted the referee, the contestant, and the scorekeeper to be the same person. But then to refuse to concede the system that made it so. Because for so long in our democracy, we've been afraid to call out the flaws of the system for fear that it would push us further back. And I don't know how much further back we can go when tens of thousands of Georgians are stripped of their right to vote in broad daylight by the person who was constitutionally obliged to protect it. And so for me, that moment was about acknowledging what happened, but then saying, I'm not going to take it anymore, and I'm not going to participate in it anymore, but I'm not going to do so in a way that is about making me governor. Challenging that election was something that people had mentioned, and I still get a few people who are like, well, you should have fought harder. Fighting to make myself governor made that election and the theft of those voices about me, and that's not right. This was about the promise of our democracy and the commitment to our citizens that their voices would be heard if they showed up, if they were able to show up. And for me, the larger responsibility, and the one my mom and dad raised me to hold, was that your job is to fix the problem for others, not just to fix it for yourself. And so Fair Fight was born. And I'm proud of the work we've done. Over the last 2 years, we have built voter protection infrastructure across 20 states. We have helped elect governors. We, more importantly, though, have helped defend voters. And we are part of a coalition of organizations that are working to protect this election every single day. And the reality is, when this election is over, it's not over. Evil doesn't relent simply because it gets pushed back. In fact, it redoubles its effort. And so my belief is that the work will not be done until we have the legal protections that restore what we had with the Voting Rights Act, but finally fully achieve what we should have had with the Constitution, which is that the right to vote is real for every American. And that's what we're going to keep fighting for.
Where can people see this very important documentary?
Well, people can see it on Amazon Prime, and we're so happy to be able to share that this weekend, October 29th, the film will be streaming for free in front of the Amazon paywall, which is something they don't do a lot.
And for our international viewers, it is available worldwide for free, on the Amazon Prime YouTube channel.
That's fantastic. I really encourage people to watch this documentary. It is engaging, it is important, it is informative, and there's a lot of heart and a lot of solution. If you are not aware of and in love with Stacey Abrams and all that she does, you will fall head over heels, because she is one of our angels on this planet. She is one of the people doing the good work. And her story reverberates, and her experience reverberates into a very large story that is America. And it's really important for us to understand it. We have gotten two really important bits of information in this conversation. One is that voter turnout is the best answer to voter suppression. So I remind everybody to get out and vote, that each vote matters. And also that being informed and knowing that voter suppression does exist and asking the questions. You don't have to let it frighten you. There are people that actually have the correct information. I like to tell people, if you are questioning if it's voter suppression, it probably is.
And can I just say one thing, just in terms
Yes.
of, you said at the beginning, Tracy, about, it's not the courts that are going to save us, it's the people. And if you think of certain elections, transformational elections, like the 2008 election of Barack Obama, or like Stacey's run in 2018, and you think about the new voters who came out, and okay, Stacey had to end her campaign, right? But she brought 1.5 million new voters in Georgia to the polls. Obama brought, I think, 15 million new voters into the conversation. You looked at AOC's election, 10 days before the election, she was 15 points behind likely voters. Why? Because there were all these new voters who they didn't know were really likely, all these young folks who didn't turn out and then upset that prediction. So we really do have power. And President Obama said it the other day in his speech in Philadelphia. We have 50% voter turnout. what would Congress, what would our country, what would our state houses look like if we had 70%, 80%, 90%? Who would be in those halls? So when people think, my vote doesn't matter, they're all the same. I get it. It's, there's a lot of parts of that that's true. But if we really showed up, it could be a different America. And there's hopefulness in that.
And I think this is millions of us are the answer. We really need to turn out, stand up joyfully and go and take that action and vote. I mean, I get so much self-esteem from it. As we close and as we leave, is there anything that either of you, any of you would like to say?
I just invite everyone to be all in the fight for democracy.
That's well done.
I always go to James Brown. He said, get into it and get involved.
Oh, I like it. Thanks, James Brown.
Thank you, Tracy, for leading such a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. This was an
pleasure
absolute
with
treat.
such a woman of power.
Oh, please. Oh, the last thing I'll say is on the 29th, that's my birthday. So it's my birthday gift to everyone for you to be able to see it for free.